todos y a todas. Esperamos que estén bien. Sean muy bienvenidos en esto.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. We appreciate that you've taken some time to have this discussion. This webinar about transitioning and navigating the energy transitions is organized by IISD. Bear in mind that you have the option to listen in English or in Spanish.
Introducción, algunas palabras. Mi nombre es Diego de Ricio.
As an introduction, I am a part of GGON for Latin America. We are working on the phasing out of gas. I'm going to be the moderator of this session. One of the main problems, we apologize, but the quality of the sound is not very good. So we apologize for anything that we cannot hear. This event wants to reflect this situation, especially in Latin America, the gas situation. So what do we want to, when do we mean? The region has been always a big exporter of oil, but recently there have been some changes that show some new challenges, not just with exports, but also with imports. So in the Latin American and Caribbean area, there are also some opportunities and advantages. According to a recent report, there are some good conditions to really bet on renewable energies. But this is not always simple to implement, and this is why we are doing this webinar, partly to try and understand the whole context. So firstly, we want to present the global context in the terms of gas and oil. We're going to talk about Mexico. One of our speakers. Then we are going to debate on the situation in Argentina, which where the tendencies, the trends have changed recently, and there is a big open debate about gas and oil. And in the third place, we have Pablo Salon, who is going to talk about Bolivia and the situation there. Then we will have a Q&A session, so please use the chat to write your questions or to intervene. Now I'm going to give the floor to Angela Picciarello, researcher on fossil fuels and on the opportunities for renewable energies. Angela, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Diego, for the introduction, and let me share my screen. There we go. Thanks everyone for being here with us today. What I would like to do in this brief presentation is to share some of the findings from the IISD report, Navigating Energy Transitions, mapping the road to 1.5 degrees, which we published in October last year. Just to give a bit of an idea of what we did in the report was the first ever comparison of a large number of climate and energy pathways in order to outline what needs to be done from an energy supply perspective to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. To do that, we analyzed a selected number of IPCC 1.5 compatible reviewed pathways, as well as a number of other authoritative and widely used pathways from academia, intergovernmental organizations such as the IEA or IRENA, and private consultancies as well, like Bloomberg, for example. It's important to note that the data and our analysis is mostly global in scope. So while it cannot provide insights into the peculiarities of the political and socioeconomic situation of the different countries, which I think we will hear more about in the next interventions, it nevertheless can usefully set the scene for what we are going to talk about, as well as remind ourselves of what level of ambition is needed from a climate perspective. Basically, this is one of the key findings from our analysis. And what this graph shows is that there is no room for new oil and gas development according to all the analyzed scenarios. So you see on the right-hand side of the graph the scenarios that we analyzed. And you see that with some difference in the steepness level of the oil and gas decline, they all point out to a consistent decline in oil and gas production from now until 2050 by around 65% minimum. What the graph shows also, which is quite interesting, is that if we look at the fields that are under development or already producing, which is the gray area in the graph, these already take up in terms of emissions most of all of the carbon budget allocated to the sector. So any new fields and exploration, which is the orange area at the top, would either make us go beyond the 1.5 degrees limit or would generate investments and infrastructure that risks becoming uneconomic and stranded quite soon. Of course, in order to phase out oil and gas production, there is a need to phase in alternative energy sources. We looked here at wind and solar because they were identified by the IPCC for being the technologies with the highest mitigation potential at the lowest cost. And what you can see from the graphs is that based on current policies, both the projections for wind and solar are quite insufficient from now until 2030. There is a huge gap in deployment for these technologies. We would need around 2.5 times the wind that is projected to be added to the system and 50% more solar. And this is just some conservative models. There are pathways that point out to a much higher deployment needs for both technologies, up to 3 times higher than this. Just a point on the question of finance, because I know that finance keeps being a recurrent theme in the transition. And in this slide, I don't want to talk exhaustively about how to finance the transition, but I just want to mention that there is an order of magnitude which is interesting to consider. So if we look at the needed uptake for wind and solar in this graph, and we look at the investment forecast for these two technologies based on the current policies, this is what we would have in terms of investment gap to get where we need to get, basically, in 2030. And if we look at investment projections for new fields and explorations in oil and gas that are, by the way, incompatible with the 1.5 degrees limit, this investment projection is actually bigger than the investment gap in wind and solar. So definitely this could be a starting point for the transition to move away the investment from the oil and gas sector towards cleaner energy sources, and they would already free up a number of resources that would be useful for the transition itself. To go a bit more into the gas question, since the focus of this event is on gas, we looked at gas power generation because this is the #1 use of gas worldwide. And you see the finding here is quite similar to oil and gas production. So already operating gas power plants take up the carbon budget for the whole sector from now until 2050. So there is no room for new gas power generation until the 2050, because again, it would make us go beyond the 1.5 degrees limit or risk creating considerable stranded assets. I think it's important to mention something that is from a previous IISD study. It's a report called Step of the Gas. So in that report, we looked at the uses for gas in the global south and the possible alternatives for these uses. And there is something which is quite interesting to see, that especially for gas power generation, there are already cost competitive alternatives to this, which are wind and solar with storage. And these apply to global south countries precisely. Now, this is not the case for other gas uses like feedstocks, heavy industries like cement, where replacing gas is a lot harder, but those represent smaller shares of gas use in the global south. So definitely some of the gas could already be replaced fairly competitively in the short term. A final aspect that I would like to focus on is the idea of exporting gas, because we know that many countries in the world either use a lot of gas domestically for different usages or are exporting or considering exporting gas abroad. And it's important to look at what's happened in Europe in the last few months related to the war in Ukraine, because we've seen gas prices skyrocketing, in particular in Europe. And that, of course, has caused what we call the dash for gas in a number of countries, especially in the Middle East and in Africa, where countries are trying to step up their gas production in order to supply more gas to Europe and substitute previously gas provided by Russia. Maybe this is a bit less relevant for the Latin American region, but actually I read a few days ago about the Wintershall deal in Argentina with Germany to provide LNG to Germany and to Europe. So, and I would like to hear from Ariel later what he thinks about that. So probably this is happening already in Latin America. Back in October, for the report, we did this analysis where we tried to look at how Europe could meet its own gas demand without Russian supplies, basically. And what you see in this graph is the yellow line, which is the European 1.5 compatible gas consumption. And this is very similar, by the way, to the gas consumption in the Repower EU scenario, which is the blue line. And you see that apart from a short term, a couple of years shortage, from 2024 onwards, Europe should be able to supply, to meet its own 1.5 compatible gas demand without any new gas infrastructure. Now, in reality, Europe has been building gas infrastructure, nevertheless, in the last few months. But what this tells us is that gas demand is going to go down in Europe. And this constitutes a high risk for those countries which are actually betting to be able to export a lot of gas to Europe in the near future. And in fact, just to update you on what's happened since we produced that graph, the IEA for the first time has said that the EU gas demand fell in 2022 by 13%, steepest drop in history. EU, this is very new, it's from 3 days ago, is proposing to extend its 15% cut in gas demand through next winter as well. And even if infrastructure is being built, not necessarily it will be used. So already the RWE utility in Germany has been announcing that probably a lot of the LNG new capacity may not be fully utilized. And Zero Carbon Analytics has been doing some analysis on the new LNG capacity added in Europe, which risks providing 65% more gas than Russia was supplying in late 2022. So it's definitely excessive, and it might not be utilized, which means that a lot of the gas prospects for export might not be there in a few years. Just to conclude, governments should prevent the development and licensing of any new oil and gas fields if we are to stay within the 1.5 degrees limit. There is no role for gas in countries' energy transitions, and there are largely cleaner alternatives that are already more competitive than gas. And betting on gas as a future export perspective is extremely risky. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Ángela, por habernos introducido tanto por el panorama global como también de los escenarios de Europa, un gran jugador en términos de demanda actual y futura de este combustible fósil. Entonces, yendo también, digamos, de una perspectiva de importación, de mercado, y también que ha tenido diversas repercusiones por los hechos geopolíticos recientes, nos interesaría ir hacia México ahora. Entonces, por eso invitar a Luis.
We are going to have Luis Fernando Perez Macias from Mexico, associate researcher of National Council of Science and Technology. He's going to present the context of natural gas in Mexico. I'm going to touch on the energy dependence and infrastructures. Luis.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you very much, Diego, for your introduction. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the landscape and the general situation of natural gas in Mexico. I'm going to talk about the changes in infrastructure that have been happening and what this means to the energy policies in the country as a whole, and in particular about natural gas, as I said. My idea is to talk about the current processes that are going to define in the medium and short term a possible energy transition in the country. So here we can see the current situation. There's been a massive drop, around the 41%, in the production of natural gas in the last years. But specifically since the peak of production of natural gas in 2009. And as I said, it was a very big decrease in a situation in which Pemex has more and more difficulties to produce this natural gas to supply the demand in the country. Its production decreased 37% in the last 15 years. And in the last 2 years, the production has increased slightly, but what we can see in the research is that the situation will stay flat, but it will not increase to the levels we had before. So we can see that the peak has passed, peak of this natural gas production, and we will see a decrease in the production. The reserves have also declined in a 70% in the last 20 years, and the natural gas reserves could, at the recent pace that we have right now, last for 7 years. The idea is to try to show that it is not just about this decrease of the natural gas production in the country, but this goes hand in hand with a huge increase of the demand in this natural gas in the Mexican economy. It is a gas or a source of energy that covers 47% of the energy demand in the country as a whole. It is a bigger amount than the one covered by hydrocarbons or other types of fuels. So as I said, it's very important for the Mexican economy. And it has mainly been based in a growth that we have seen over the last years, thanks to the energy sector. The energy sector used to use 16% in 1994 of these natural gas, and it has grown to reach 60% in 2021. So it is not a demand that it's based directly in the home use, since it represents less than 1%, but mainly it depends on the energy industry that consumes this kind of energy that we get through the production of natural gas. This industry exports this type of energy, as we will see in my further slides. But what we can see is a current model in which we import natural gas to use it in the industry to produce electricity, to then use this in the exports. And this is what has made it possible for the country to be in this position that we are right now, that it's conditioning not just our energy matrix, but also the changes of the transition. There are three factors or three elements that we have to take into account when we talk about this change in the situation of Mexico over the last years. And it has to be, first of all, with the rise in demand of hydrocarbons because of the gasification of the Mexican electric sector. And also because of energy policies that has been developing over the last 10, 15 years, though what have done is increasing this dependency on the imports on the US due to the fragile situation of shale gas in Mexico. So we can say that Mexico, because of this situation, it imports a huge amount of natural gas. And the value of these imports has been increasing over the last years. Actually, in 2021, it was half of the value of the oil exports. So this idea that Mexico is an exporting country of oil, it's more and more fragile. And it's questionable as well, since, as I was saying, the imports of natural gas now represent over half of the total value of these imports. So this is the landscape that it's conditioning the current situation in the country, the productive situation, and the energy situation. And we can see what the situation of the infrastructure related to natural gas imports. And we can say that it's something essential to understand the whole landscape. We're talking about huge importing facilities, gas pipelines to import this natural gas that represent huge investment projects that are a very important part of the national budget in Mexico. And we have a need to make them more and more profitable in the middle of this fragile situation of natural gas that the US is involved in. more than 99.3% of the total imports of natural gas in Mexico come from the US. And this infrastructure has been developed over the last years. We can see here on the right at the map. We can see in purple the gas pipelines, which is a new network that was developed in 2011. And as we can see here, are part of the north border, and they distribute this natural gas over the country. We also have different terminals to transport liquefied natural gas that at that time were enough to supply the demand, to meet the demand in the country, but it's not enough now. What has happened over the last years is that building these gas pipelines has been a problem for the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, or CFE, which is the one who has promoted the construction of these gas pipelines. It has legal obligations with the US for 21 billion cubic feet per day when the current demand in Mexico of natural gas is less than 8 billion. So we can say that it's triple, this legal obligation is triple that the current demand in the country. So obviously this is a complex situation, there's lots of speculation and subordination of the national energy policies to what it's happening, to what the situation is in the US. And this is basically the result in which the country is right now. But what has happened over the last few years with regards to this complex situation? Well, so the energy policies have tried to make the most of these investments, of these legal obligations that they have with the US. And what we saw was the opportunity of exporting natural gas. We have been seeing over the last few years this process that what it does is to make use of these contracts that exist. Instead of using the natural gas for the domestic demand, we use this natural gas to meet the demand of at an international level. In Mexico, we've got 9 projects of liquefaction of natural gas in Mexico. And from these 9 projects, one, it's being built right now in Baja California. And beyond one of these projects, or all of these projects being mere speculation, altogether will need at least 7 billion of cubic feet per day, which is an 89.5% of the current demand in Mexico. And if they actually are finalized, they will make Mexico the 4th biggest LNG exporting country. So, well, this is a general overview. And as we can see, this is a change of the situation. What we are facing right now is a change that is taking us to become an exporting country of natural gas. And this is the situation in which we are right now after we reach this peak that I was talking about some years ago. This infrastructure is promoted mainly by the national company of energy, and that uses resources that we could use for other projects as well. Since these projects right now are looking for a way of using these resources and making the most of them. So as a conclusion, what I would like to say is, well, this is the general overview of the situation we've got right now in the country. We're in a process of a transition. We're trying to change the budget, also the energy policy thanks to the natural gas, which is an essential part of the energy matrix right now in Mexico, and which will help Mexico to become a natural gas exporting country. So this is something that has been happening over the last 30 years, and obviously is very important to talk about the current situation right now. But it is still conditioned by this pressure that we feel because of the US and the imports that we still get from the US. So this will be all. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Luis. Talking about the demand and the different structures, peaks of production, we thought it would be very interesting to talk about the Bolivian context. So from Bolivia, we have now Pablo Salon, who is going to talk as well about the situation in Bolivia. He works in the energy production. He's a researcher, and he has published a very important report that talks about what we have been covering today, and that's why we really welcome him and we want to hear what he has to say. He's also the founder of the Salon Foundation, and yeah, so we really want to know what you have to say today. So I give you the floor. Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here today. And I'm going to be brief. I'm going to talk about Bolivia specifically. So nowadays, what's the situation that we have? Well, we can see in this slide from 2020 that 80% of the energy in Bolivia is natural gas. Then we have oil with 12.41%, biomass, that it's mainly firewood, and that it's used for burning or kitchen in rural areas. And then we have hydro energy with just 1.49%, and wind and sun energy with just 0.16%. So Bolivia, we could say that it's mainly focused on natural gas. But what can we say about the production of natural gas in Bolivia? Well, we can see that 60% of the natural gas that we produce is exported. It is an 88%. It represents 88% of the exports. But we also have a very important feature, is that we also produced different types of oil. We don't have a production of oil that meets the demand that we have, and that's why we have to export this oil. So we export natural gas, but we import oil. And this is important to take into account the general landscape of Bolivia. So this is what we produce, this is what we export, what we import. But if we talk about what we consume in Bolivia, we can say that in the first place, we've got diesel. It's not gas. And a big amount of this diesel is imported. Then we have natural gas with a 22%, the different types of petrol, most of which are imported. And then we have, again, biomass, which is in a very important status, and then electricity. And 70% of this electricity comes from thermoelectric that work thanks to natural gas. More or less 25% is produced by hydroelectric power plants. And then we would have the alternative ways of energy and biomass. This is a general landscape of what Bolivia was in 2020. But if we want to talk about what has happened over the history, we can see it here. Until 2014, as you can see here in the graph, with this first line here, we can see that the gas production was produced in thousands of kilobarrels of oil equivalents. We reached the 133,000, but from then it started to decrease as it happened more or less in Mexico. We can't find any more gas reserves. And then the production started to decrease deeply. Now we're only producing 97,000. Something similar happened, although at a smaller scale, happened with diesel or oil, that it went from its peak, which was 23,000 in the 2014, and it reached 15,000 in 2020. So we can see that it's been an increase in solar energy and wind energy. But if we compare the situation with the other types of energies, we can see that it's really small. In the case of wind or solar energy, we're talking about a peak of 180 compared to the almost 133,000 of gas. And then we have the hydroelectric power, which it did have a peak, but we'll talk about that in detail later. But what has the situation that has been forecasted for Bolivia? Well, this is an estimation of what could happen. And what we can see is that it decreases the production, and this would mean that the exports would also decrease. We can see here the exports to Brazil and to Argentina, and we can see what will happen in 2040. We have already suffered a decrease in the number of exports to Argentina. And there is a main factor that has led to an energy crisis this year. And it's that in 2014, our exports represented $6,000, and we imported diesel and special petrol with a value of $1,000. However, last year we had the inverse situation. So the total amount of exports was 2,000 and the total amount of imports over 4,000. So we have a deficit between what we export and what we import. And this difference cannot be covered by the state anymore. Bolivia cannot use any more dollars because these dollars have been used to cover the difference between imports and exports. It's been used on getting these types of imports, so special petrol and diesel. So this is a very urgent situation in which we are right now. Last year, the government tried to change this situation and tried to increase the number of exports through hydroelectric power. However, this project failed. It had a massive environmental impact, and there wasn't a specific market for this type of power. Also important to take into account is that we have an installed capacity that it's double or more than double that what we actually consume. And this installed capacity, it's through hydroelectric power plants. And I would like to use the last minutes I have to talk about the situation and what we can learn. So in the case of Bolivia, we cannot talk about an energy transition yet. We can talk about a crisis energy. We have to stopping using natural gas is going to lead to a crisis. What will happen is that subsidies that were over diesel and petrol and natural gas will have to stop. And this will have a massive repercussion in prices, in transport. And we will have a very big social problem due to this situation. Secondly, I have been studying energy production. And what I think is the problem is that saying that the developing countries are the guilty ones and that we are in a different situation. Well, I understand this kind of narrative, and I think we should get a compensation because of the climate change's consequences that we're facing right now. But if the Bolivian government doesn't take the measures that needs to be taken, we're going to see ourselves in the middle of a very difficult situation. And then finally, we cannot study this energy transition only talking about sources of energy or investments in hydrocarbons or alternative ways of industries. The topic is much more complicated than that. And then finally, to conclude, there was a nationalization of some sources of energy, and I think this is something very important for an energy transition. However, what happened in Bolivia was the other extreme. The nationalization was so big that we couldn't produce solar energy, because that meant that the individuals who tried to produce this kind of energy were doing it against the state. But then another different problem that we have is that in Bolivia, we have been using different mechanisms that haven't worked. In Bolivia, we used the energy to get votes, and this has had dire consequences. I think we should talk clearly about subsidies and how we stop these subsidies on fossil fuels. This is not as easy as we think. It is not easy to stop the subsidies in fossil fuels. This will have a massive social impact, and we need a specific transition plan and not just a slogan. I'm not going to talk into much detail about all the other points, but what I would like to say to conclude is that there is another aspect that normally we don't talk about when we talk about energy transition, that it's the change of this anthropocentric relationship that we have with nature. And this is something very important. And with this, I conclude. Thank you very much. And you're very welcome to read more in detail this publication that we have done.
El mercado externo, divisas, crisis social, cuestiones de cambio con relación sociedad-naturaleza, como también, digamos, las posiciones del sur con respecto a cuestiones climáticas. Todo eso, un montón de esas cosas también se transitan en la Argentina, y por eso es un excelente pie también, por lo que señalaba Pablo recién, como mercado del gas exportado de Bolivia, en cómo se está transitando estos últimos años, a partir sobre todo de encontrar nuevas fuentes de exportación. Es por eso que se ha invitado a Ariel Slipak. Él es licenciado en Economía y docente de la Universidad de Buenos Aires, candidato a doctor en Ciencias Sociales por la Universidad Nacional de General Sarmiento. Coordina el área de investigación de la Fundación Ambiente y Recursos Naturales. Han publicado numerosos trabajos en torno a combustibles fósiles, clima, inversión externa, etc. Así que muy invitados e invitadas a que consulten la página de FARM. Último aviso, también no dejen de mandar preguntas y comentarios por las modalidades habilitadas, así esto se puede retomar en los próximos minutos.
So here we have Ariel Slipak. Ariel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to share with all of you my conclusions. I'm going to share my screen. Sometimes it's not easy to be the last one because you would like to reply to some of the things that I've heard. Argentina has a very big tradition in gas, as you will see. And we are seeing a declining of conventional gas, which is being replaced by exploitations in Vaca Muerta with very serious social and environmental consequences, not just related to the Paris agreements, but also with seismic problems and problems with the native populations in Patagonia. So I'm going to start with the conclusions. As I said, Argentina has a dominance of gas. Vaca Muerta is being presented as a sort of salvation, economic salvation, and the response to the crisis and the employment crisis. But we don't see it like that. It has been now 10 years since the agreement that to the start of this exploitation in Vaca Muerta. We have exploitation onshore and offshore, both. They're also promoting this idea of gas as a bridging fuel, and we don't agree with that either. And as I said, they are also presenting fossil fuels in Argentina as a solution. And at the moment, the fossil fuels have economic privileges that it is important to dismantle so that we can redirect all this to renewable energies. So we're going from conventional gas to gas in Vaca Muerta. We need to say that primary energy model in Argentina is 86% based on fossil fuels, of which 52% is gas, as you can see here. Energy sector in Argentina has 51%, it's 51% responsible for greenhouse emissions. And non-conventional gas is responsible for 12% of greenhouse emissions. So you can see here primary energy offer, how it is distributed. You can see in yellow that gas is every time more important. I'm going to go forward a bit, and you can see the evolution of gas extraction, conventional, shale, and tight. So you can see that conventional is declining and shale and tight is increasing progressively. So in Argentina, if we see the total of emissions here we can see the total due to gas, and we can see that every time it is more important. On this slide, you can see the territorial distribution. There are a total of 19 basins in Argentina. The yellow ones are onshore and the green ones are onshore and offshore. The gas from Neuquén Basin used to be conventional. The exploitation of Vaca Muerta was discovered in 1931, but became more important later on, thanks to the YPF agreement. So today we have gas from Cuenca Neuquina on 64%, and also from Cuenca Austral, which represents 24% of the extraction of gas. So in the North Atlantic, it's also important to mention the environmental and social impact that the extractions are having. Here we can see some key dates. We can see how the conventional is going down. We can see that there was some privatization, but then in 2012, there was a partial renationalization of YPF, which is now partly state, belonging to state in 51%, and 49% listed on the stock exchanges of Buenos Aires and New York. In 2013, another important date, there was the signature of this contract between agreement between YPF and Chevron in Vaca Muerta. And between 2018-19, there has been an increase, as we've been saying, of non-conventional gas. There is this narrative of Vaca Muerta as a salvation of the lack of foreign exchange in Argentina, Vaca Muerta like a national sovereignty issue, and also this idea of gas as bridging fuel that contributes to decarbonization. So Vaca Muerta is presented as a solution for the decline in imports from Bolivia. So Vaca Muerta can then supply the gas for the north of Argentina. So this was the idea, to reduce imports from Bolivia, natural gas and liquefied gas. So all the pipelines and the oil pipes has a very, very big impact socially and environmentally. Gas as a bridge, as a bridging fuel, this is all part of the government narrative. So there was this national plan of adaptation and mitigation against climate change. And it includes the use of fossil fuels as a bridging fuel, as a transition fuel. We don't share this view. Gas and fossil fuels have very privileged situation economically, so they have differential access to currency. They have job flexibility they are offered, especially with the government of Mauricio Macri. Companies could negotiate special contracts, and they included multitasking, multi-jobs. There are also some mechanisms to generate certainty to the companies, and there are also subsidies that are offered for fossil fuels. Here you can see the subsidies to energy generally, and the subsidies in dollars. What we want to say, the main issue here is that a big part of these subsidies goes to a distribution company, a commercialization company. A big part goes to carbon. So we are subsidizing carbon. And we also subsidize demand, offer. You can see on this graphic. So these subsidies for offer are growing very rapidly, and we think this is scandalous. We are not really giving people the chance to have a good tariff. So you can see here where these subsidies go, the different companies, the distribution. So I'm trying to conclude now. In 2023, the subsidies are going to be more than 0.5 of the national budget, and that is a very big amount. And subsidies to the offer represent 450 of an 85 times bigger. With petrol is a little bit different, but you can see here all the names, all the companies, and how a few companies really take the majority of it. So here we see again where subsidies go, and you can see TechPro, YPF, and CGC, mostly these companies. So we think that we need measures to decarbonize, to move away from gas. And I want to conclude with a sentence from Pablo Bertinat, energy specialist. It's not just about the 1.5 degrees. Argentina has very big emissions, so now we need to reduce those. We need to change in a systemic way. We need to defossil, deprivatize, deconcentrate, decentralize, decommoditize, and democratize. And this is more or less it in summary. Thank you. Thank you, Ariel. So now we have a new actor in the region as well. And of course, the need of people is important. So we now can comment, and we can have a bit of a debate about the issues that we have been mentioning. So first of all, what is the idea of fossil fuels nowadays? Not just climate change, but also from a point of view of geology, of the market. So the question that I would like to make, Latin America doesn't have big reserves or big production, but there is a lot of pressure because of the demand. So you described the situation. But what is the debate in Mexico and in Central America about these new pipelines? And how is the transition to renewables going? How has it been going in the last few years? A very, very complex issue. Yeah. So it's important, as I say, to look at the multiple dimensions of energy and the transition. In the case of Mexico, the construction of pipelines with US and also with LNG, that's very recent in the last 10 years, and it has really transformed the infrastructures, and it has transformed the energy model in our country. So we are debating this currently, and it is part of the national debate. But we still haven't seen the full picture. We still haven't seen all the risks, the dependencies that it generates. And in terms of energy, in terms of economy, and in terms of environment, all these three elements need to be analyzed. We will have to see. So as I say, yeah, it's all ongoing. And there are projects to export to Central America. We already had projects before. And the LNG gas overcame, really won the race, really, against companies in other companies. And so we have a really big project at the moment in that sense. And talking about the energy transition, and investment on renewables, we also have a big debate in Mexico, especially in terms of control of these investments. There is an electrical market, which is very, very new, 6-7 years in the country. And there is and it's all being very much disputed. There are hundreds of projects in solar and wind energy. And what the new government is trying is regulate these investments, because there is a lot of speculation in the market now that wasn't there before, especially in the electric market, which depends on gas. So we need to support these electric projects. And aside from that, the electrical network doesn't have a lot of capacity at the moment in the country to be able to absorb all these renewables. Thank you, Luis. Angela, in the last part of your presentation, you were talking about Ukraine and how is this affecting European market. Could you maybe go into more detail and analyze a little bit the perspectives and how everything how is all been navigated? Also, maybe mention the climate impact related to gas imports.
For the question, Diego. I think it's a really important question, because what we've seen in Europe in the last year, more or less, has been largely an energy security focus. So, that has been the big focus on making sure that you can keep the lights on, you have your industries working, you have your factories working, and the climate angle has basically slipped down to the least so badly. So, you know, there has been continuous attempts of increasing the gas supply infrastructure, especially LNG one, and that has gone ahead. But on the other hand, Europe has huge commitments on its plate in terms of policies, like the Repower EU is per se a huge commitment that if Europe goes through with it, which seems like it will mean that by 2030, there will be a almost 50% decrease in gas demand compared to what's happening now. So Europe has been, you know, a bit acting myopically, in the sense that has strong climate commitments, has pretended not to see the climate commitment for the time being and increase the gas infrastructure, which is highly problematic because, again, will risk becoming stranded. But on the other hand, has been slowly starting now to reduce its gas consumption. And I think this is really the key message here for countries. You know, I was hearing the other presentations of the panelists, really interesting. The idea that some of the countries are trying to profile themselves as exporters, even of imported gas at some point. And this is an interesting idea, because not only there is clear signs that Europe is indeed gonna reduce its gas consumption until 2030, but that the whole world is gonna do that. You know, we were looking at the zero carbon analytics data, some of which I presented in the presentation, and they have made analysis that clearly show that gas demand globally is gonna peak by 2030 if countries go ahead with planned policies. If they comply with their own long-term climate commitments, then there's going to be a 10% reduction in global gas demand compared to current gas. So it's not only a problem of Europe. Overall, globally, it seems that gas is peaking anyway. So it will be interesting to see how that will play out, you know, in the next 6-7 years, because this is what we are talking about, and how these plans that are currently happening in Argentina, in Brazil, in Bolivia will play out in such a short term.
Muchas gracias, Ángela, y toda esta descripción, digamos, que hace sobre...
Thank you, Angela, for explaining the European situation and how the demand is clashing against other visions. So, Ariel, maybe you would like to comment. Maybe you could expand a little bit more and maybe give a little bit of a regional perspective in Argentina so that we can understand how the demand works. Yeah, thank you for the question. I am concerned about this narrative where gas is a bridging fuel as part of the national plan in Argentina, but also generally if we don't have policies so that we can meet the 1.5-degree target, is going to be a problem. Economy is very erratic in Argentina. The government in Argentina when Ukraine conflict started, they considered that to be an advantage, an opportunity for them. So they have the gas, but the problem is they don't know how to distribute it. So there is a big pressure for new infrastructures, especially pipelines, but also for oil. So they want to change the legislation. So there is a legislation in Argentina, some laws that protect some areas like Patagonia, for example, and the government changed that so that they could do more exploitation and they could do more pipelines. And obviously there was resistance from the native communities there, from the local communities. So there is this need to export. So they're trying to present Vaca Muerta as the big salvation for the country, and also lithium as a salvation, another option. So there was also all these new pipelines are presented as a solution also for employment for the local people. So they are also talking to the National Bank in Brazil in terms of financing these exploitations. So we need to take that to keep that in mind too. I can't see a very clear policy for phasing out gas, quite the opposite actually. So Argentina, in order to meet the 1.5-degree target, shouldn't really build new infrastructures, shouldn't expand exploitation. And what is most worrying for me is fracking and the problems it carries. Seismic problems. We have seen also water pollution. And this is obviously creating violence against the Mapuche people. So this is all very problematic. Not just the 1.5 degrees. Also, another thing that worries me is this big appetite for financing. And they want a lot of financing for Vaca Muerta. So the forecast is between $7,000 and $10,000 million in billion to finance the whole Vaca Muerta exploitation. So I'm leaving it here.
We're talking about how on one hand, we've got the future scenario that we want and how we went through different peaks related to natural gas and the situation of crisis and reconversation that you were talking about today, and that has kind of failed. And you were also saying, and I think this is probably the main point, and this is what I want to ask you about, it's about the situation of Bolivia in relation to property. What happened, what worked, what failed, and how we could extract lessons from there, and what's the current situation. So probably to conclude with this part and start answering questions that we've got in the chat, what I would like to know is what Bolivia it's an example in the actual climate narrative. And if you would like to talk about more in detail about this. Yes, thank you very much. I think that the problem was that in 2006, when we were in the middle of this process, the idea was to nationalize gas to industrialize the country. And that's why we passed different laws and norms to subsidize the supply and not the demand, as Ariel was saying. And what happened is that we were paying a third of what oil and petrol costs in other countries. Gas is subsidized for home consumption, and all the money that we get from oil fields has led prices to be subsidized during all these years in Bolivia. And all this happened thanks to the nationalization of gas. We got different benefits from this. We could use this money to give it to the elderly, to students. So the idea was to use the natural gas for the population's benefit. And society depends on these subsidies. However, these subsidies have to come to an end now, because it's not possible to keep these subsidies with the levels of export and production and level of import of hydrocarbons that we've got right now. So the crisis that we have right now in Bolivia, it's very dangerous, it's very difficult, because we are not only talking about stopping using gas because of its environmental impact, but it's coming out of a form of extractivism that it's deeply rooted. Universities, municipalities, everyone gets money from the money generated, from the money coming from these exports. So this goes beyond what we were talking here. It's very complex. It goes beyond the climate change. I think we need proposals that are in line with this current situation of the countries. Otherwise, we're going to end up talking about a reality, and I understand and I share it, that it's only global, but then that it's not in line with the concrete reality that countries are living right now, or the people that live in the country right now, as it happens in Bolivia. I think this is the case in Bolivia. It is not just about this narrative that talks about stopping using fossil fuels. I think what we should be talking about is about a transition that works for each country. I think the situation should be different for each country. We've been listening here what the situation is for 3 countries, and they are very diverse. I think if we don't do this, our message will not have the effect that we want. So I think this is basically the main message that I would like you to get from me today. Thank you very much, Pablo. Obviously, when we talk about energy transition, as you have all said, a main issue has to do with the environmental impact in the territory. And we have a question about this for Luis. What are these impacts in relation to health and the environment in the territory, especially when we talk about hydrocarbons, but also about other different types of fossil fuels and natural gas and oil? And if anyone else has any other questions, please, you can add them in the chat, but we can start answering this one right now. Well, in the case of Mexico, when we talk about natural gas, we can say that 20 years ago, it was not widely used, and it was not the main type of hydrocarbon in the country. It was mostly related to oil fields. And even nowadays, the one who uses the most natural gas is Pemex and uses it to extract oil. So the relationship between the environmental impacts of gas extraction or transport of gas is closely related to the production and the extraction of oil and the oil industry in Mexico. Recently, and of the last few years, with the increase of imports in the country, and because of the situation of the electric power right now that it really uses natural gas, we can see a new interest in studying what the environmental impact is of natural gas. And there have been different attempts to try to measure, to try to see what's happening. But I think the main problem nowadays, and what we can say will be the problem in the future, is that this dependency on natural gas and the increase on transport facilities and on consumption will create a bigger pressure on the investments in the non-conventional fields in the country. We've been talking over years that the big fields for the extraction were in non-conventional fields, but they weren't very cost effective. However, if the prices rise, the imports of gas from the US won't be enough, and our energy matrix will depends basically on natural gas. We'll have to use these non-conventional fields. And I think this is the main risk when we talk about the environmental impact in our territory. Although we also have different types of risks and impacts that we can see right now that are not inferior, but I think the ones that we will face in the future that we don't see right now are the ones we should study. Thank you very much, Luis. There are some questions here that are related to investment for infrastructures. So maybe you would like to talk about this. So maybe talk about the capital injections and imports and exports. Yes, of course. Well, I think firstly we should talk about not only loans, but the company investments. There is a very important research of Gustavo Garcia, who has written a lot about the topic, and I recommend that you research about it. Talks about how different legal tools for companies makes it easier for them, not just these access, this differential access to capital, but also gives it another benefits. The contribution that these kind of investments has in receiving capital in cash in Argentina is not such. The contribution that they do to improve the situation is not such, because the dollars end up out of Argentina. And then secondly, I would like to talk about the types of funding. We are very concerned about them. We have been studying them for years, and we've got some studies that we still have to publish. But we would like to talk about the situation of different campaigns that are trying to stop governments and development banks stop financing fossil fuels And there is also some pressure in order to get these finance, so from 7 to 10 billions in investments. And what do we have at the end? Well, the worst types of companies that want to invest. Everyone knows the World Bank and other main investment tools. However, here we're talking about different organizations that end up investing fossil fuels, or even invest other types of industries, for example, weapons. And I don't think they contribute to better the situation in the country. And we end up having the worst kind of companies to invest on this idea. And well, I hope that this answered your question. Well, yes, thank you very much, says Diego. Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And thank you very much for the interpreters that made it possible to communicate with our speakers today, and that made possible communication in 2 languages. Thank you everyone who has been here, and just as a reminder, the session was recorded and it will be made available to everyone. Thank you very much to Angela for organizing this event, and thank you for the speakers for being here. Thank you very much on behalf on IISD to everyone who's here, and we hope we can keep the conversation going. See you all in the near future. Yes, says Angela. Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, says Luis.
Muchas gracias nuevamente.
Thank you, says Ariel.